let's get into this. We all know information is power, right? But sometimes tackling huge, complex topics, especially things like documented human rights violations, can feel, well, pretty overwhelming.
Absolutely. So today we're doing a deep dive into what's documented regarding human rights violations in the People's Republic of China. We're basing this on material from sources like the Government of Canada and Human Rights Watch.
And our goal here really is to unpack what these sources are telling us, what's happening, who's affected, the why behind it, who's responsible.
Exactly, and how long this has been going on, and importantly, what these reports say Canada is specifically doing in response.
Okay, so starting with the scope. These reports, they don't mince words. The Canadian source uses the term gross and systematic human rights violations. That's pretty strong language.
It is, and Human Rights Watch really points to a noticeable increase in repression under President Xi Jinping. They talk about a widespread lack of basic freedoms, expression, association, assembly, religion, things many people just take for granted.
It's not just a general feeling either, is it? The sources are specific about who's being targeted.
Very specific. They highlight Uyghurs and other Muslim ethnic minorities and Xinjiang Tibetans, and also Falun Gong practitioners. Both sources mention these groups specifically.
And it goes beyond those groups too, right?
Yes. Human Rights Watch points out that human rights defenders, perceived critics of the government, journalists, lawyers, even their families, they face persecution too. It's quite broad.
So what kind of actions are we actually talking about? What does this repression look like according to the sources?
Well, the reports detail some very severe actions, things like mass arbitrary detention, people being held without, proper legal cause.
And one's detained.
Reports mention torture, cruel, or inhuman treatment. And alongside that, mass surveillance is a big one, mentioned in the sources' really pervasive monitoring of people.
And forced labor, too. That's mentioned by both sources as well.
Correct. And Human Rights Watch connects this to broader strategies. Like in Hong Kong, they mention new national security laws brought in 2020 and updated just this year, 2024, which have really clamped down on civil liberties.
Leading to arrests for peaceful activities.
Exactly. Arrests and convictions. Plus, there's the whole issue of tight control over information, the so-called Great Firewall, and also over religion through this policy they call sinicization.
Sinicization, what does that mean, basically?
It essentially means forcing religious groups to conform to the state's ideology and cultural norms. It's about control.
Which brings us to the why. Why is this happening, according to these sources, and who's directing it?
Both sources seem to point towards a systematic campaign led by the government. The aim appears to be centralizing control under the Chinese government and President Xi Jinping specifically.
So groups are targeted if they're seen as threats or critics?
That's what the sources suggest, yes. They need to be suppressed to maintain that central control. Responsibility is placed pretty squarely on Chinese authorities and specific senior officials mentioned in the Canadian documents.
And in terms of timeline, this isn't brand new, but has it gotten worse?
Human Rights Watch indicates it's been increasing over the past decade, particularly under President Xi. Specific campaigns, like that sinicization policy, started around 2016, and the Hong Kong security laws are very recent, 2020 and 2024.
And crucially, is it still ongoing?
Based on the sources, absolutely.
So given this scale, what's the international community doing? What about Canada's specific role as detailed in these sources?
Well, there are some international efforts mentioned, like US and EU laws trying to block goods made with forced labor, but the Canadian source focuses on Canada's direct actions.
Right, using the Special Economic Measures Act. What does that actually involve?
According to the government material, since March 2021, Canada has imposed sanctions. This means things like an asset freeze and financial prohibitions against certain listed individuals and one entity.
And these are people identified as being involved in these gross and systematic human rights violations.
Correct. They are identified for their roles. The source also states these listed individuals, including former and current senior officials, are inadmissible to Canada. They can't enter the country.
And it's not a one-time thing. These measures are being updated.
Yeah, the Canadian documents show amendments and permits being issued over time, with updates noted as recently as late 2024 and early 2025. So Canada is actively managing these sanctions.
So wrapping this up, we've seen quite a detailed picture from these sources, the extent of documented human rights violations in China, the specific groups affected.
And the specific methods used, like detention, surveillance, forced labor, and these legislative tools like the security laws. Plus, Canada's targeted response using economic sanctions against identified officials and entities.
It really paints a stark picture. So, the final thought for you, the listener. Given everything detailed in these sources, the scale of this repression, what does it really mean for global accountability? How effective are international actions like these sanctions? And maybe what more could understanding these details empower you to consider about responsibility on a global scale?